Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host, and joining us, as he is almost every week, is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, glad to have you.
Hey, Brandon. Always good to be on with you. How are the kids doing?
We're doing wonderful. Getting ready for baby number 6 here, so everyone's excited.
Just amazing. That's great.
Hey, since you came back to the United States, you have been already doing some different events and talks. You were recently at the C3 conference at Loyola. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was good. It's kind of a tech conference. They're trying to get people in the archdiocese here who are involved in parishes and ministry and want to know more about, the technology available to them. And they asked me to speak. And my opening move is always to say, I know I'm like the media bishop or I'm the tech evangelist. But I said, look, I don't know anything about the practicalities of technology. In fact, you had to rescue me all the way from Orlando. Remember, I got there and I had this PowerPoint ready, but we were missing the first 7 images. So anyway, thank God you were there and Joe Glore and others on the ground. I wouldn't know what to do to fix the problem, But anyway, I talked to them about beauty in the Catholic tradition. I think the new media are great ways to bring forth the beauty of our tradition, and that Catholicism lends itself to this visual medium. So that was the point I was making. So it was good.
Well, every now and then on the Word on Fire show, we like to take a popular video or an article or something that's making the rounds on the internet and toss it around a little bit, do some little commentary and discussion. And so today we're going to discuss a video that I've seen popping up all over Facebook and Twitter. Right now it has 2.5 million views on Facebook, so it's clearly getting around. It's a little 4-minute interview between Larry King and Neil deGrasse Tyson. Do you know much about Neil deGrasse Tyson? Have you seen him before?
Just a little bit. I've seen him on Bill Maher's show and other places where he kind of stakes out the, more skeptical rationalist position, the more, I would say, scientistic position in regard to these things. But anyway, I don't know him that well.
Yeah, so Tyson has become sort of a leading scientific figure today. I tell people it's kind of like when I was coming of age in the 90s, Bill Nye, the science guy, was kind of like the science figure. I think Neil deGrasse Tyson has become that today, but the difference with him is that he actually has bona fide credentials. He's a trained astrophysicist. He knows the science inside and out. So he's a good person to listen to, and he's pretty fair-minded toward religion. He tends not to disparage it. I think he calls himself an agnostic or an atheist. He's not a religious person, but I think he has some interesting things to say. So let's go ahead and listen to this. Again, the clip's 4 minutes long. We're going to break it up here into chunks. The first chunk here is maybe our longest one. It's about 2 minutes. So let's listen to this first 2-minute section of their interview.
Facts and belief. I know the religious people believe, the scientist says prove. What do you believe? What do you think happens when we die?
Well, so I can make some unassailable statements about what happens when you die. So you spend your life eating food. Food has a calorie content, and calorie is a source of energy. Calorie is a unit of energy. You bring it in, and then the energy is available for you to maintain your body temperature at nearly 100 degrees. It's 98.6. How do you keep something at 100 degrees when nothing else around you is? You're burning energy to sustain that. Because biologically, we need to be at that temperature to function. Okay? You also need energy to walk and to move. That's why you eat food. The moment you die, what happens? You don't maintain the energy. Your temperature drops. How far does it drop? To room temperature. At a funeral, in the casket, if you touch the hand of the person in the casket, your first thought is, the body's cold. No, it's not. It's room temperature. But it's cold compared to 100 degrees. They're no longer burning this energy. Okay, so now, every one of your molecules has energy within it. If you get cremated, that energy gets released in the form of heat. And you heat the air, and that air radiates to space. You get buried, which is how I want my body to be disposed of. Bury me. Bury me. Because you know why? I don't want the energy content of my body to just get radiated out into space, of no use to anybody. Put me in the ground. Let the worms, microbes, come in and out of my body. And the energy content of my body that I had assembled over my lifetime consuming the flora and fauna of this earth. My body then returns to them. And thus is the cycle of life. I know that's going to happen because you can measure where the energy goes. And that's how I want to go out.
Yeah, no, I was amazed by that. I did watch the video, and I frankly had forgotten there was that kind of cool new agey music going on, because what they're trying to do is they're grasping at something religious and mystical, because it's deep in the human heart. See, that we know that. But the best we can do is this, cycle of life. That does almost nothing for me. I mean, to imagine that, sure, my body can feed a couple of worms. I mean, that's the best I can come up with. So it's trying to cover a sheer materialism with a kind of patina of mysticism, and it's just doing violence to the human heart.
Well, let's stay on that meta point here for a second. That, and you've said this several times, that today's scientists have become sort of a new priesthood, and I've noticed that past scientists, maybe like a Stephen Hawking, who talks, through his voice box, it's real cold, it's real mechanical, but scientists more and more are using almost a homiletical preaching style. They're embodying the priesthood in so many of its dimensions. I think too of a friend of mine, Trent Horn. He said, many people dismiss what you say if you have a white collar, like you, Bishop, but if you're wearing a white lab coat, they'll take you seriously.
Sure. And that's one of the results of the scientism I've been complaining about. And I think that's absolutely right, that the scientists have become a new priesthood, and that white lab coat is like a vestment, And so they have the kind of supreme authority, the way perhaps a priest philosopher in the Middle Ages, or the way an Aristotle or Cicero would have had in the ancient world. In our time, it's the scientist who knows the truth of things. And as I've said now 100 times, I'm totally with the scientist. What he's describing is indeed what happens to the body. I completely agree with that. What we can measure of bodies and so on is absolutely right. The problem is always the scientific reductionism, as though that's it. What I can see and measure and so on using the scientific method, that is coincident with reality. That's the problem, because it overlooks all kinds of indicators of higher dimensions, different dimensions of human life and experience. The scientific viewpoint will write those off as at best epiphenomenal. That's to say, it's kind of a little phenomenon it's a side effect of material processes. We're going to insist, though, no, these are as real as the physical. In fact, more real. But that's getting ahead of our conversation a bit.
Yeah, let's focus on the content of this first couple minutes. So the title of this video, I forgot to mention at the outset, is What Really Happens When We Die? How do you answer that question? What really happens when we die? And Neil deGrasse Tyson, as I assume many people would, relies purely on a materialistic description of what happens when we die. But what are some other ways of answering that question?
Well, it's very interesting because you can tell Larry King, you heard it there a little bit in his question, but then as the thing goes on, you see it more and more. He's got something else in mind. He wants to know, what happens to me when I die? See, he's going after this personal identity. What Tyson does is immediately translates that into, as you say, something very objective, measurable, empirical. What happens to the body when it dies? But that's not the question. And the question is born of an experience that's very powerful, that there's something in me, or I would say rather around me. As Aquinas says, the soul's not in the body's in the soul. We can talk about that later. But there's something in me that is not reducible to cells and molecules and energies and calories and all that business. So he shifted the focus of the question right away to what happens objectively to the body. But King and I think most of us want to know, what happens to me? So here I am now speaking to you. Does that involve the body? Of course, my vocal cords and my hands and voice and so on. But there's me, right? I'm talking to you. What happens to me when I die? He shifted it right away into this simply objective empirical dimension, where we're interested in something more spiritual.
You know, it reminds me, especially in this interfacing of science, philosophy, theology, of the question, how did the universe come to exist, or why does the universe exist? And oftentimes skeptics or atheists or agnostics will only give the material answer, the material explanation, when there are so many more interesting ways to answer that.
Yeah, and that's, whether you call it scientism or naturalism or materialism, see, what's interesting and people often don't see, that's a philosophical perspective. You don't prove scientism scientifically. You don't prove materialism through the scientific method. Rather, those are philosophical assumptions, all of which are questionable, So what we have to do, and you're suggesting correctly, is shift ground to philosophy if you want to debate naturalism versus, something else, let's say our take on the world. But that can't be adjudicated simply on scientific grounds. That's just question begging.
What'd you make of that last section of this opening segment where Neil deGrasse Tyson says he wants to be buried? And why? Because he wants the energy content of his body to sort of return to the earth and help the earth or help other people. To me, that strikes me as odd for an atheist or agnostic to want to help the earth after his death. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's such a narrow little perspective. Okay, sure. Okay, my body will waste away and worms will be happy for a little bit before they're devoured by something else. I mean, how that's going to satisfy some deep longing of the heart. But what you're driving at, though, is something else, which is, where do moral values come from? If you're a strict atheist, there's absolutely no God whatsoever. I don't know how you avoid the conclusion that all ethical values are just they're epiphenomenal. They're just customs born of our sociological experience or evolutionary development or something, but they don't have any real objective integrity. So why would you bother? Why would you care whether the worms have a little meal with your body? So it's that anomaly that we're always motivated by moral concern, in fact. And those that want to deny God are denying that truth as well. There's something stubbornly in us that wants to be moral or sees the value of it. And if you follow that line, it'll lead to God.
All right, let's listen to a little bit more here. We'll do another 20-second segment of the interview.
Okay.
And that's how I want to go out.
But you're not conscious, and that's for eternity, right?
Yeah, there's no evidence that I have any consciousness of anything. And by the way, is that so weird? Did you have consciousness before you were born? Were you saying, how come I'm not on Earth? My gosh, I need to be on Earth. Or where am I? No, there's just the state of non-existence.
Well, I find Larry King interesting there, because Larry is kind of speaking, I think, for a lot of people. There's something in us that rebels against the idea that we simply go into non-existence. That consciousness, so he's saying consciousness. I'd use a term like identity, right? My personal identity. It's repugnant to some very deep instinct in us that we just disappear. Now, why? Because I would suggest there is indeed evidence, and there's a famous word, evidence. When scientific people use that, they do it reductively. They mean measurable data, right? I would say there's all kinds of rational and experiential warrants for holding to another dimension of our experience. If you want the details, go get Robert Spitzer's books sometime and read all the evidence he's compiled, impressively enough, both from the great tradition and from our contemporary period, that strongly indicate identity and consciousness do perdure after bodily death. So I'm reactive to that, but I'm also deeply sympathetic to Larry King's instinct, which is, it's very deep in us. We don't just disappear. There's something trans-physical about who I am. And so he's up against a scientific reductionism that wants to just eliminate that as at best epiphenomenal. But there's something that's very substantive about that conviction.
Let's keep listening here, because I think Larry King articulates exactly what you're getting at here. So here's the next segment.
No, there's just the state of non-existence. And so I'm not given any reason.
But now I am born,
Okay.
and I can't stand the thought of non-existence. See, I already have existence. I accept
Okay, it is true. We fear death because we are born knowing only life.
Right.
I get that.
Do you think most people feel that way, Bishop? Now that I am born, now that I do exist and have consciousness, I can't stand the thought of not existing.
Yeah, I do. And I don't think that's see, what Tyson does is, again, typical scientific move is he pats you on the head. Oh, I know, I get it. It's a little psychological hang up you have, poor thing. Once you grow up and get a little smarter, you get over that little hang up. But see, Larry King, now not in a philosophically sophisticated way, but he's speaking there as kind of a Jedermann, kind of an everyman, quite correctly, I would say, that no, we rebel against the view that I simply disappear with bodily death. He might not be able to articulate that at a high level, but he's feeling it. And I don't pat that on the head as Tyson does and do a little tut-tut with it. I think that's a very real experience. Now, we can, maybe in our next step, we can do some of that higher articulation. Look at Aquinas on the immateriality of the soul, for example, and you start seeing what Larry King is intuiting along with most human beings, and which Tyson is patting on the head as a little psychological hang-up.
Let's go down that path. So Tyson doesn't think that your consciousness or your existence continues after death. Larry King does, and I think most people probably do. How would you answer Neil deGrasse Tyson? What arguments or evidence would you put forward to suggest that we don't just become annihilated at death?
Here's one from Thomas Aquinas. There's such a unique quality to human consciousness. We take in empirical experience, so we see things, we can imagine things, but then we go beyond that. We do something that animals can't do. Namely, we can abstract from our empirical experience a pure form. Now, this is called abstraction. This is called higher knowing, or the knowing of a universal essence. Good example is mathematics. All of mathematics operates at that level. Sure, it begins, if you want, with ordinary experience. We look at the world and we can count things and so on. But when you come to higher mathematics, you're dealing with pure abstractions that are not tied to matter or particularity. If they were, they wouldn't be knowable as an abstraction. Another example is any type of conceptual perception. So when I perceive humanity, not an individual human, but humanity, look at it even more concretely. When I read a language, that I can recognize the letter A in a variety of instantiations, right? I can write a big A, small a, I can write in about 1,000 different fonts, right? But yet I recognize A. What am I recognizing? If you say the brain and imagination are purely physical, then all I've got in my mind is an image of some kind. But if that's all I've got, I can't recognize the pattern in this 1,000 varieties of the letter A. See, I'm driving it. The mind has an abstractive power that can rise above mere materiality. That's the hint Aquinas and many others have argued, that the mind has an immaterial dimension. Now, you want to bring it back down to earth, and here I'm following someone like Robert Spitzer. Look at the data on near-death experience. For Tyson to say simply blithely, there's no evidence, that's simply false. There's tons of evidence. When you look at the very detailed literature on near-death experience, there's extraordinary evidence for consciousness, identity, whatever you want to call it, the soul, the transphysical self, existing beyond physical death. So I could do a high philosophical account, and I can do a more, if you want, empirical account of near-death experience. But I think there's a lot of indications that Larry King's instinct is a good instinct.
That book, by the way, that we keep referring to is Father Robert Spitzer's book called The Soul's Upward Yearning. We'll have a link to it beneath this video, but he covers several contemporary near-death experiences. And so as Bishop Barron says, it seems that there's a lot of evidence. Okay, let's wrap up this clip. We're going to listen to the last 1 minute segment, and then we'll discuss it from there. So here's the final minute from the interview with Neil deGrasse Tyson.
It is true. We fear death because we are born knowing only life.
Right.
I get that. However, I take another view because I've been asked, if you could live forever, would you?
Yes.
Okay, we're
Don't
done
even
on
have
the
to
interview.
finish the sentence.
Yes. No, okay, sure, that's an attractive idea. But the way I look at it is the knowledge that I'm going to die that creates the focus that I bring to being alive. The urgency of accomplishment. The need to express love. Now, not later. If we live forever, why ever even get out of bed again? Because you always have tomorrow. That's not the kind of life I want to lead.
Yeah, I think they're both right and they're both wrong. Do you want to live forever? And Larry King says, yep, I sure do. Well, yes, if by that you mean, do I have a deep sense of a dimension of my life that will go on beyond this one? Yes. But do I want to live forever in this life? I don't. I don't at all. That to me is like a vampire. You know what I'm saying? A vampire is damned to live in this life forever. Christian eschatology is not about everlasting life in this world. It's about a transfigured life, a heightened life in that dimensional system we talked about last week. You know, so in that way, I would say Larry King is wrong. I don't want to live forever in this world. And I think Tyson is right in saying the thing about urgency, that we do have a sense, we who live in this dimension, that we're not here forever. And I think that does give you a sense of urgency, things I want to accomplish in this life. Now, I look forward to another higher, elevated life. But he's right in saying that death, the fact of death, does give an urgency to this life. So there I kind of agree and disagree with both of them, you know.
All right, let's back up just a little bit. Say Neil deGrasse Tyson and his mystical New Agey music are out, and you're in the seat. You're talking with Larry King, and Larry King asks you, what really happens when we die? How would you answer that question?
I would say we go into a higher dimension of existence, that we are brought before the presence of God. You know, I'd use language like that, but I'd say we are drawn into a higher pitch, a higher realm of existence. Now, we could bring in all the issues of judgment and heaven, hell, and all that, but I think just at a preliminary level, I'd say, no, it's not the end of life, it's the awakening to a higher life. As we say in the liturgy, you know, life is not ended, but rather changed. That we undergo a change similar to the caterpillar becoming the butterfly, to use the hackneyed image, or the one I used from last week, the square becoming a cube, the triangle becoming a pyramid. It's a transfiguration into a higher dimension. I'd say something like that. I wouldn't deny for a second what Tyson says about the body. I mean, sure, the body, you know, goes back in the earth and so on. Now, am I given an elevated body? Yeah. Now, if we really got into detail of our eschatology, yeah. The soul is reunited to the body at a higher pitch of existence, you know. But I think the first answer would be we're awakened to a higher life.
Christianity says that Jesus conquered death. What does this mean concretely for us?
Well, Jesus' conquering of death has to do with our salvation, because there's physical death. There's also the death of the soul. There's also damnation. And Jesus, by his dying and rising, conquers death in the full sense. I mean, his resurrection shows God's sovereign power over the physical, and his dying and rising provide the possibility of the forgiveness of our sins. And so in that double sense, both physical death and spiritual death, the risen Christ is the conqueror. He's the victor over that. So now if you really want to press it, I think with Larry King, I'd begin with more philosophy and that sort of thing. But you really want to go into the serious stuff. Now we're talking about the risen Christ. Risen, by the way, body and soul. This is not a Platonic game we're playing here. Body matters. Look at me, touch me. I have flesh and bones, not like a ghost, right? The salvation of the whole self. That's what the risen Christ means.
Well, it's time now for a question from one of our listeners. Today we get to hear from Matt from Northern Virginia, who asked a good question about God and the arguments for God. Here's Matt's question.
Hello, Bishop Barron. My name is Matt from Northern Virginia. My question is, I follow the argument of the existence of God from contingency, that he's not a being among beings, but is being itself. How do you make the leap, then, from God as being to God as person rather than being is just a thing among other things? Thanks, and God bless.
Good. Love these philosophical questions. In one way, it's very easy to answer that question, because to say that God is being itself, it doesn't mean he's being in general. Don't think pantheistically, like think of the whole universe and bring it all together as one. That's God. No, that's what Thomas calls ens commune, or being in general. God is ipsum esse, which means the sheer act of to be itself. Now, if God is the sheer act of to be itself, it means there's no limitation to his manner of being. So, Brandon, your being and my being are limited by the fact that we're humans, right? We're human beings. So we're beings, we exist, but we exist in a very definitive way. I don't exist the way an antelope does, the way an angel does. I exist as a human, right? That's true of any creature. The angel exists in an angelic manner. Technically, that means that in us, existence and essence do not coincide. Existence is delimited according to an essence principle. Okay. God, in whom there is no distinction between essence and existence. I am who I am, right? To be God is to be to be. Well, that means that God's manner of being is unlimited, right? There's no limit to the way God is. Therefore, any and all ontological perfection belongs to God. Whatever is good and true and beautiful within the existential realm belongs to him. That must include, therefore, intellect, will, freedom, etc., right? All the things that make someone a person belong to God. So here's a quick answer. God is not a person among persons. You're right, not a being among beings. But he's never less than personal. He's so much more than personal. He's hyper-personal. Precisely as ipsum esse, God is the full expression of mind, will, freedom, personality, all of that. So we're not dealing with some vague force. I know that's the trouble when you say God is not a being, but ipsum esse, it sounds a bit like, I'm dealing with some vague cosmic force. No, you're dealing with the creator God in whom all ontological perfection subsists. So, of course, God is personal.
Well, thanks for that great question, Matt. If you have a question for Bishop Barron, be sure to visit askbishopbarron.com and record it on any device. Well, thanks again for listening to this episode. We got a favor to ask of you. If you could, please go to iTunes, click on the Word on Fire show, and leave us a review. The more reviews we have, the more iTunes recommends our show to new listeners. So please do that. It just takes a few seconds, but it means the world to us. If you go to wordonfireshow.com, you'll find a direct link to iTunes to leave that review for us. So please take a couple seconds and help us out that way. Well, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.